Chapter 1. The Weight of Whispered Mercy. The midnight air in the Ashfall territory tasted of damp cedar and the metallic tang of oncoming snow. Ayla knelt in the dirt, her fingers stained with the emerald juice of crushed lungwort and the dark, sticky reality of a stranger's life. Every breath she drew felt like a theft because, in this pack, Omegas were meant to be invisible vessels of labor, not keepers of the healing arts. The shadows of the weeping willow draped over her like a shroud, shielding her from the prying eyes of the sentinels who patrolled the jagged stone ridges above. She moved with a practiced, silent grace, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why did the universe keep sending the broken to her doorstep when she barely possessed the strength to keep herself whole? Beneath her trembling palms, a rogue pup whimpered, his fur matted with filth and a jagged tear across his flank that leaked the very essence of his young life. He was small, perhaps only 6 winters old, with eyes that held too much terror for someone so small. Ayla didn't know his name or his lineage, yet the agony radiating from his small frame pulled at her soul with the force of a tidal wave. She knew the law. To heal a rogue was treason. To practice medicine as an Omega was a death sentence. But as she looked into those dilated pupils, the laws of men felt like brittle autumn leaves under the weight of a child suffering. She whispered a soft, melodic hum, a song her mother had hummed before the Great Purge, aiming to settle the boy's frantic pulse. Carefully, she applied the herbal poultice to the angry wound, watching the way the flesh puckered and fought against the intrusion. The pup's breathing hitched, a tiny hand clutching at the hem of her threadbare tunic. Because she had spent her entire existence being overlooked, Ayla had learned to see the things others ignored, like the way the wind shifted before a storm or the flicker of hope in a dying animal's gaze. She pressed her hand firmer, ignoring the ache in her own joints, and envisioned the cells knitting together. The world around her blurred until there was only the scent of pine, the heat of the boy's fever, and the desperate need to snatch him back from the precipice of the great beyond. Hours bled into the darkness as she worked, her movements rhythmic and certain despite the looming threat of discovery. She lived in a land where strength was measured by the sharpness of one's teeth, yet she found her power in the softness of a bandage. As the bleeding finally slowed to a sluggish drip, the boy's eyes drifted shut in a heavy, healing sleep. Ayla leaned back, wiping sweat from her brow with a grimy sleeve, feeling the heavy silence of the forest press in on her. She belonged to no one, a ghost wandering the fringes of a society that viewed her as a defect. Why did she continue to risk everything for a world that wouldn't even acknowledge her name? Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A low, vibrating hum began to rise from the earth, shaking the very roots of the willow tree. Ayla froze, her ears straining. It wasn't the wind or the prowl of a local predator. It was the sound of iron meeting stone and the rhythmic thud of 1,000 boots. War horns erupted in the distance, their brassy voices screaming a warning that turned her blood to ice. The Ironfang Pack was no longer a distant rumor whispered by the elders over fading hearths. They were here. The horizon glowed with a sickly orange hue as the first of the border watchtowers went up in flames, casting long, dancing shadows across the valley floor. Because the invasion had begun, the time for hiding was over. Ayla scooped the sleeping pup into her arms, her muscles screaming in protest as she scrambled toward the hidden limestone caves. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke and the terrifying primal musk of alpha warriors on the hunt. She could hear the screams now, the high-pitched yelps of her kin and the deep guttural roars of the invaders. Her territory was being dismantled, brick by bloody brick, by a force that knew nothing of the mercy she had just practiced. Every step felt like a gamble with fate as she navigated the treacherous terrain. She reached the mouth of the cave just as a flash of silver light cut through the trees. A scout? An assassin? She didn't stay to find out. As she tucked the boy into a narrow crevice behind a curtain of ivy, she realized her hands were shaking violently. The pup was safe for now, but the forest was screaming. The Ashfall pack was falling, and the monsters who had arrived were not looking for survivors. She peered out from her hiding spot, her breath catching as the first wave of black-clad warriors broke through the tree line. their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger that promised only extinction.
Chapter 2. The Harvest of Iron. The taste of victory was always ash and copper, a flavor Kael had known since the day he first shifted under a blood-red moon. He stood atop the charred remains of the Ashfall gate, his heavy broadsword dripping with the evidence of his efficiency. Around him the world was a cacophony of destruction, the crackle of burning timber, the frantic clatter of retreating paws, and the triumphant howls of his Ironfang brothers. He felt nothing but a cold, hollow vacuum where his heart should have been. Power was a lonely mountain, and he had climbed to the peak by stepping over the bodies of anyone who dared to show hesitation. Mercy was a luxury for the dead, and Kael intended to live forever. His second-in-command, a scarred warrior named Torin, approached with a feral grin, his armor splashed with gore. The assault was a masterpiece of brutality, a swift strike that left the enemy gasping for air they no longer owned. Kael acknowledged the report with a curt nod, his golden eyes scanning the chaos for any sign of a true challenge. Because he had been forged in the fires of the border wars, he knew that a suppressed enemy was a ticking bomb. He didn't rule through love or respect. He ruled through the absolute certainty that his blade would find the throat of any man who blinked at the wrong moment. Yet as he watched a group of his men corner a group of trembling non-combatants, a strange, unwelcome twitch flickered in his jaw. He turned away, his boots crunching on the debris of a shattered life. He told himself the hesitation was merely tactical, a waste of energy to kill those who couldn't fight back. But deep in the recesses of his mind, a memory of a small wooden cradle from his own childhood tried to surface. He suppressed it with the ruthlessness that made him a legend. He was the Iron Alpha, a creature of steel and instinct, sent to claim this valley for his people. The Ashfall territory held resources his pack needed to survive the coming winter, and sentimentality wouldn't fill empty bellies or warm, freezing dens. He moved through the smoke like a vengeful god, his presence enough to make even his own men lower their heads in fearful reverence. The battle shifted toward the central plaza, where the last of the Ashfall defenders had made their desperate stand. Kael led the charge, his movements a blur of lethal precision that defied the heavy weight of his armor. He didn't need to shift to be a beast. The monster lived just beneath his skin, claws itching to tear through the veil of civility. He cut through a line of spears as if they were nothing more than dry wheat, his internal roar drowning out the pleas of the fallen. This was the only language the world spoke, and he was its most fluent orator. Why did the sight of the burning village suddenly feel like a weight around his neck? As the resistance crumbled into dust, a sudden movement near the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A small wounded figure was dragging itself through the dirt, the heir to the Ashfall throne, a pup no older than his own youngest brother. The boy's leg was crushed, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying clarity as he looked up at the giant looming over him. Kael raised his sword, the moonlight catching the wicked edge of the steel. The execution of the bloodline was standard protocol to ensure no future rebellions could take root. It was the logical choice, it was the Alpha's duty. He looked down at the child, and for the first time in a decade his grip on his weapon faltered. The boy didn't beg. He simply waited for the end with a dignity that shouldn't belong to someone so small. Because the Ironfang Code demanded the total eradication of the enemy, Kael knew his men were watching, waiting for the killing blow that would seal their conquest. The air grew heavy with the expectation of death. The sword felt heavier than a mountain in his hand, a physical manifestation of every soul he had sent to the abyss. He took a breath, the scent of smoke filling his lungs, and prepared to do what he always did. Just as he began the downward arc, a blur of white and brown darted from the shadows. A girl, small and ragged, threw herself over the pup, her body a shield of flesh against his cold iron. Kael snarled, pulling his strike at the last possible microsecond, the tip of his blade whistling past her ear. He looked down in fury, expecting to see a warrior's defiance. Instead, he saw a girl with eyes like a forest after the rain, staring up at him with a courage that made his entire world tilt on its axis. The battlefield around them seemed to vanish, leaving only the Alpha and the girl who dared to stand in the path of his wrath.
Chapter 3. The Kiss of the Forbidden. Ayla didn't think about the steel or the monster holding it. She only saw the terrified eyes of the boy beneath her. The cold kiss of the sword's passage had nipped at her skin, but she refused to flinch. She felt the Alpha's presence like a physical weight, a crushing aura of dominance and rage that threatened to snap her bones. He was a mountain of muscle and scarred leather, his face a mask of brutal handsomeness that terrified her more than any beast. But the pup was shaking, his life leaking into the thirsty soil, and she was the only thing standing between him and the darkness. "Move, Omega!" the Alpha roared, his voice a low vibration that rattled her teeth. He stepped closer, the shadow of his massive frame swallowing her whole. The warriors around them had stopped their slaughter, circling the trio like vultures waiting for the final act of a tragedy. Ayla looked up, her neck straining, and met his golden gaze with a steady, unwavering focus. She saw the flickers of conflict behind his eyes, a storm of iron and fire that spoke of a soul at war with itself. Because she had nothing left to lose, she found a reservoir of strength she never knew existed within her frail frame. "He is a child," she said, her voice surprisingly clear amidst the crackle of the flames. She didn't move. Instead, she leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the pup's sweat-soaked forehead. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated compassion, a spark of light in a world of absolute shadow. She began to chant under her breath, her hands moving over the boy's mangled leg with a rhythmic certainty. She ignored the gasps of the Ironfang soldiers and the rising murmurs of her own captured people. She was breaking every taboo, performing a miracle in the middle of a massacre, and she didn't care if they burned her for it. The Alpha's sword hand trembled. Ayla watched as his fingers loosened, the weapon slipping an inch toward the ground. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, or perhaps a mirror reflecting a version of himself he had murdered long ago. The air between them hummed with an invisible energy, a spark that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wasn't just the fear, it was something ancient and primal, a tether of fate that snapped taut the moment their eyes locked. She felt his hunger, his loneliness, and his hidden agony, all swirling together in a cocktail of sensory overload. "You dare perform the healer's rite in my presence?" Kael hissed, though the venom lacked its usual sting. He seemed mesmerized by the way her hands glowed with a faint, ethereal light as the pup's breathing evened out. Ayla didn't answer with words. She simply continued her work, her touch leaving a trail of warmth that defied the winter chill. She was showing him that there was a power greater than the blade, a strength that didn't require the spilling of blood. Because she was an Omega, she was supposed to be the weakest thing in this valley, yet in this moment she held the most feared man in the realm captive with nothing but a prayer.
Suddenly, with a clatter that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence, the Alpha's sword hit the cobblestones. The iron rang out, a funeral knell for his reputation as a merciless butcher. Kael stepped back, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. The warriors of both packs stood frozen, their mouths agape at the sight of their leader disarmed by a girl's mercy. Ayla felt the tension snap, the immediate threat of death receding just enough for her to draw a full breath. She had cracked the armor of the Iron Alpha, and the world would never be the same. But the reprieve was short-lived. The Ashfall elders, appearing like shadows from the ruins, began to scream for her blood, their voices shrill with a different kind of hate. "Treason!" they wailed, pointing their bony fingers at her. "She heals the enemy. She saves the monster's seed." Ayla felt the cold hands of the Ashfall sentinels grab her shoulders, yanking her away from the pup and the Alpha. They didn't see the life she had saved. They only saw the rules she had broken. As they dragged her toward the center of the plaza, her eyes stayed locked on Kael, wondering if the man who dropped his sword would be the one to pick it up again to end her life.
Chapter 4. The Predator's Claim. The wooden platform of the Ashfall execution square felt abrasive against my bare knees, the splinters digging into my skin like tiny accusing needles. High above, the moon was a cold, uncaring eye, illuminating the faces of my own people, people I had healed in the dead of night, who now bayed for my execution with a terrifying, unified hunger. They called me a traitor because I had chosen a child's life over their ancient, blood-soaked grudges. The elder, a man whose gout I had treated just a week prior, raised a rusted ceremonial blade, his voice trembling with a self-righteous fury that masked his own cowardice. I looked toward the shadows where the Ironfang warriors stood like statues of obsidian, their presence a silent testimony to our defeat. Death didn't frighten me as much as the silence from the man who had dropped his sword. Kael stood at the edge of the torchlight, his massive arms crossed over a chest that seemed too large for the air it consumed. Because he remained motionless, my heart began to wither, assuming his moment of mercy had been a fleeting glitch in a machine built for war. The elder's shadow loomed over me, the scent of unwashed wool and sour wine filling my senses as he prepared to strike. I closed my eyes, bracing for the bite of the steel, praying the pup I saved had found a way to crawl into the darkness of the woods. Suddenly, a sound like a mountain splitting open echoed across the plaza. It wasn't a scream, but a roar of such raw, dominant power that the elder fell backward, dropping the ceremonial knife into the filth. I opened my eyes to see Kael moving, not with the lumbering gait of a man, but with the fluid, terrifying grace of a predator who had decided the hunt was back on. He didn't use his sword. He simply walked through the crowd, the sheer force of his alpha command pushing the Ashfall sentinels aside like dried husks of corn. Every step he took toward the platform felt like a heartbeat, heavy and inevitable. "This female belongs to the Ironfang now," Kael declared, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to bypass my ears and settle directly in my marrow. He stepped onto the stage, his presence so overwhelming that the air around me turned electric and thick. The elder scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of indignation and terror as he tried to protest the theft of his victim. But Kael didn't even look at him. His golden eyes were fixed on mine, burning with an intensity that felt like a brand. Why was he risking the stability of a conquered territory for a nameless Omega who had done nothing but defy him? Before anyone could breathe, Kael's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip that was firm yet strangely devoid of the cruelty I expected. The moment his skin touched mine, a jolt of pure, white-hot energy erupted from the point of contact, spiraling up my arm and crashing into my chest like a tidal wave. It was the mate bond, a myth I had been told Omegas were too lowly to experience, flickering to life with a violent, undeniable heat. I gasped, my vision blurring as the world dissolved into the scent of rain-drenched earth and wood smoke that clung to him. He stiffened, his pupils blowing wide until his eyes were nothing but twin pools of endless night. Because the bond had sparked, the atmosphere in the plaza changed from a scene of execution to a theater of primal claiming. Kael didn't let go. Instead, he pulled me closer, his heat radiating through my thin tunic, until I felt like I was melting into his shadow. The Ashfall Council stood paralyzed, realizing they were no longer dealing with a conqueror, but an alpha protecting his prize. I looked at the dark leather of his bracers, my breath hitching as I realized that my life had just been traded for a different kind of captivity. Was this salvation, or was he merely preserving me for a more private form of torment? "She is a prisoner of the Ironfang," Kael repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper intended only for me. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, sending a fresh cascade of shivers down my spine. "If you touch her again, I will burn what remains of this village to the ground." With a sharp tug, he led me off the platform and toward the line of black horses waiting in the mist. As we walked through the gauntlet of staring eyes, I felt the weight of 1,000 questions pressing against my lips. But as I looked at the back of his neck, where the dark hair met the scarred skin of a warrior, I knew the answers would only lead to more danger.
Chapter 5. The Sanctuary of Shadows. The Ironfang Fortress was a jagged crown of stone perched atop the highest peak of the northern range, a place where the wind never stopped screaming and the walls bled frost. I led the girl through the iron-bound gates, my hand still tingling from the residual heat of the bond that had nearly leveled my senses in the plaza. I should have killed her. I should have let the elders finish what they started and moved on with the business of ruling. But every time I looked at her, at the way she held her head high despite the grime on her face, my wolf howled with a possessiveness that threatened to tear me apart. She was an Omega, a healer of enemies, and now she was the greatest threat to my authority. As we crossed the courtyard, the whispers began, a low hiss of discontent that moved through my warriors like a virus. They had expected me to bring back gold or heads on pikes, not a bedraggled girl with the eyes of a saint. I ignored them. My jaw locked tight as I navigated the winding corridors of the inner keep. Because I was the alpha, they wouldn't dare speak their treason to my face, but I could feel their judgment like a physical weight against my spine. I stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the end of the healer's wing, a section of the castle that had remained empty since my mother's passing. "This is your space," I said, my voice sounding more like a snarl than I intended. I pushed the door open to reveal a room filled with the scent of dried lavender and the soft glow of a hearth I had ordered lit an hour before our arrival. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a sanctuary, equipped with mortar and pestle, bundles of herbs, and a bed covered in thick furs. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the surroundings, her suspicion radiating off her in waves that made my own skin itch. Why did she look at me as if I were about to strike her when I had just given her the most protected room in the fortress? Ayla turned to face me, her fingers twitching as if she were searching for a bandage to apply to the invisible wounds I carried. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a soft melody that cut through the harshness of the room. "You are the Iron Alpha. You are supposed to be the monster in the dark." I stepped into her personal space, the scent of her, sweet like honey and wild like the forest, filling my head until I couldn't think straight. I wanted to tell her that I didn't know why, that the bond was a collar I hadn't asked for, but the words died in my throat. Because I couldn't explain the chaos in my soul, I chose the language of a captor instead. "You are under my protection because your skills are valuable to my pack," I lied, my gaze dropping to her soft, trembling lips. Nothing more. I could see the flicker of disappointment in her eyes, followed quickly by a wall of icy resolve that made me want to shake her. She didn't believe me, and she shouldn't. I was the man who had burned her world, and no amount of lavender or warm hearths could wash the blood from my hands. I backed toward the door, needing to escape the pull of her presence before I did something truly reckless, like begging for her forgiveness. "Stay within these walls," I commanded, my hand gripping the iron handle until the metal groaned. "If you wander, I cannot guarantee the safety of your life from my own men." I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. I stood there for a long moment, my forehead resting against the cold wood, listening to the silence from within. I was the master of this castle, yet I felt like the one trapped in a cage of my own making. My peace was shattered by the arrival of Torin, his face a mask of grim urgency that told me the political fallout had already begun. "The council is calling for an audience, Kael," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the closed door of the healer's hut. "They aren't happy about the girl. They want to know why an Omega is sleeping in a queen's quarters instead of the pits." I felt the familiar surge of alpha rage bubbling in my gut, my claws threatening to burst from my fingertips. I had won the war, but the real battle, the one for the girl and the soul of my pack, was just beginning.
Chapter 6. The Whispers of Ancient Blood. Living in the Ironfang fortress was like being a bird trapped in a storm. The walls were beautiful, but the air was filled with a violence that never truly slept. For 3 days, I remained in my sanctuary, grinding herbs into powders and brewing tonics that no one came to collect. The silence was my only companion, broken only by the occasional heavy footfall of a guard outside my door. Because I was a prisoner, I expected the worst. Yet the food brought to me was fresh, and the furs on my bed were warmer than anything I had ever known in the Ashfall pits. I spent my hours watching the snow fall against the high windows, wondering if Kael was avoiding me or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to discard me. On the fourth morning, the door creaked open, and I prepared myself for the Alpha's presence. But instead, I found a line of 3 injured warriors standing in the hallway. Their faces were etched with a mixture of disdain and desperation, their wounds festering beneath poorly tied bandages. One of them, a man with a jagged gash across his chest, spat on the floor near my feet. "The Alpha says you're a healer," he grunted, his voice thick with pain. "Prove it, Omega, or we'll see how long your protection lasts when he's not looking." I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, my hands already reaching for the clean linens I had prepared. As I worked on the first warrior, I felt the heavy, watchful gaze of the pack on me. They hated what I was. A lower caste, a symbol of weakness in a culture that worshipped power. But as my fingers moved over his skin, applying the cooling salve that drew out the heat of infection, I saw the man's posture relax. I didn't speak. I let the medicine do the talking. I was a bridge between life and death, and in this hostile territory, my only currency was the relief I could provide. Why did they fear mercy so much that they had to wrap it in insults before they could accept it? By midday, word had spread, and the line at my door grew longer. I saw the way the younger wolves looked at me, not with hatred, but with a confused curiosity that gave me a sliver of hope. I was changing the narrative of the helpless Omega one bandage at a time. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The crowd of injured men parted like the Red Sea, and a new figure stepped into the room. He wasn't a warrior. He was an elder, his robes trimmed with the fur of white wolves, and his eyes held a cold, calculating intelligence that made the hair on my neck stand up. "So, this is the creature that made our Alpha drop his sword," the elder mused, his voice like the rustle of dry parchment. He walked around me, sniffing the air with an intensity that felt like a violation. I stood my ground, my hands still stained with the blood of his kin, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cower. Because he was a high-ranking member of the council, the warriors in the room bowed their heads, the air growing thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. He stopped in front of me, his gaze lingering on the pendant I wore beneath my tunic, a small silver leaf that was the only thing I had left of my father. "Do you know why he kept you alive, girl?" the elder whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the rot on his breath. "It isn't because he's soft. It's because he's curious about the light you carry." He reached out, his gnarled hand hovering near my throat, and for a moment I thought he was going to strangle me, but he simply chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the stone walls. "The Ironfang Pack has no room for light. We are the darkness that swallows the world, and you are nothing but a moth flirting with a flame that will eventually consume you." I felt a surge of defiance rise in my chest, a heat that matched the flicker of the mate bond I had felt in the plaza. "Light is the only thing that shows you where the edge of the cliff is," I retorted, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. The elder's eyes narrowed, his amusement vanishing in an instant. He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a hiss that chilled me to the bone. "Enjoy your sanctuary while it lasts, little healer, because even an Alpha's protection can't save a girl whose blood is an insult to our history. Do you even know whose daughter you truly are?" Before I could demand an answer, a thunderous crash erupted from the hallway. Kael stood in the doorway, his eyes glowing a fierce, predatory gold, his shoulders blocking out the light from the torches. The elder stepped back immediately, his face smoothing into a mask of false respect, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted in my mind, a dark flower blooming in the middle of my sanctuary. Kael looked at me, his gaze scanning for injuries, but I could only think of the elder's words. What secret was hidden in my past that made the most powerful wolves in the realm look at me with such a strange, terrifying hunger? Chapter 7. The Alchemy of Scars. The air in the healer's wing had grown thick with the scent of iron and the heavy electric charge of a storm that refused to break. Because I had spent my life in the shadows of the Ashfall territory, I was accustomed to being ignored, but here in the heart of the Ironfang fortress, I was a focal point of a different kind of energy. For days, I labored over the broken bodies of Kael's warriors, my fingers dancing through a sea of torn flesh and shattered bone. Some of these men had been the very ones to torch my village, yet as I sutured their wounds, I found that blood all ran the same shade of crimson. I worked until my vision blurred and my hands shook with exhaustion, driven by a desperate need to prove that my existence was a benefit, not a burden. Among the warriors, a hierarchy of silence had formed. Some would pull their limbs away from my touch as if I were a leper, spitting curses under their breath about the taint of an omega. Others, however, would catch my eye in the dim candlelight, their hardened expressions softening for a fleeting second into something resembling gratitude. I watched a young soldier named Elias, whose arm I had saved from the rot of an infected arrow, begin to stand guard outside my door without being ordered to do so. It was a subtle shift, a quiet rebellion against the pack's rigid hatred. Why did the most violent of men seem the most surprised by the simple act of a bandage applied with care? I felt the weight of Kael's presence long before I saw him. He was a shadow that lived in the corners of my vision, a silent observer who watched me from the darkened doorway of the infirmary. He never spoke, but the air always felt warmer when he was near, the mate bond between us humming like a distant, low-frequency vibration. It was a tether I tried to ignore, a biological trap that linked my soul to the man who had brought my world to its knees. Every time our eyes met, I saw the war raging behind his golden irises, a conflict between the alpha who demanded order and the man who was beginning to crave something he couldn't name. Because the work was never ending, I often forgot to eat or sleep, my mind consumed by the chemistry of my herbs. I was currently grinding a mixture of foxglove and dried yarrow when a sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. The warriors who were waiting for treatment scrambled to their feet, their heads bowing in a synchronized display of submission. I didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. The scent of rain and ancient pine filled the small space, and the hair on my neck stood up in a frantic greeting. Kael was no longer a shadow. He was a mountain of solid, vibrating intensity standing right behind me. "Leave us," Kael commanded, his voice a low frequency that made the glass vials on my table rattle. The warriors didn't hesitate, vanishing into the corridor like smoke caught in a draft. I kept my back to him, my hands continuing to grind the pestle against the mortar, though my heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could hear his heavy breathing, the sound of a predator trying to restrain its most basic instincts. I wondered if he was finally here to tell me my time had run out or if the council had finally forced his hand. "You are working yourself to death for a pack that wishes you in the ground," he said, his voice closer now, right at my shoulder. I finally stopped, the silence of the room feeling heavy and expectant. I turned slowly, finding him mere inches away, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hearth. He looked weary, his armor dusty from travel, and his eyes clouded with a darkness that made me want to reach out and smooth the lines on his brow. Why did I feel this sudden, treacherous urge to comfort the man who held me captive? I looked up at him, my chin lifted in a defiance I didn't truly feel. "I am working because it is the only thing that makes sense in a world you've turned into a graveyard," I replied, my voice a whisper that felt like a scream. Kael's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek as he looked down at my stained fingers. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face for a second before he pulled it back as if the touch would burn him. The tension between us was a physical thing, a wire pulled so tight it was screaming. He was my enemy, my captor, and my mate, and the realization was a jagged pill I couldn't swallow.
Chapter 8. The Alpha's Fever. The world was spinning in a nauseating blur of fire and ice. I had returned from the border skirmish with a jagged spear wound in my side that refused to close, the weapon having been coated in a silver nitrate solution meant to cripple Alphas. Every step back to the keep had been a battle of will, my wolf snarling at the weakness of the flesh. I had fought through 1,000 battles, yet this small, stinging hole was threatening to bring me to my knees. Because I was the Iron Alpha, I couldn't show pain. I couldn't let my men see the blood soaking through my leather tunic. I made it as far as the healer's wing before the darkness began to claw at the edges of my vision. I staggered into Ayla's room, the scent of lavender and honey hitting me like a physical blow. She was there, a small, radiant figure in the center of my chaos. I saw the shock on her face, followed immediately by a wall of cold clinical detachment. "Leave," I gasped, clutching the doorframe as the floor tilted beneath my boots. "I don't need your help." It was a lie, a pathetic attempt to maintain a shred of the dominance I was losing by the second. I saw her move toward me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something else, something that looked dangerously like concern. "Sit down before you fall down, Kael," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm for such a small creature. I wanted to roar at her, to remind her of her place, but my legs betrayed me, and I collapsed onto the heavy wooden stool near her workbench. The pain was a living thing now, a white-hot coal pressed into my ribs. I felt her small, cool hands on my skin as she began to unbuckle my chest piece, the contact sending a jolt of lightning through my system that had nothing to do with the silver. Our bond flared, a violent golden spark that filled my mind with images of her, smiling, breathing, belonging to me. As she peeled back the blood-soaked fabric, I saw her breath hitch. The wound was black and weeping, the silver poison spreading through my veins like ink in clear water. "You're a fool," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she reached for a bowl of clear liquid. "You could have died on the road." I looked at her, my vision swimming, and saw the sweat beading on her upper lip. She was terrified of me, yet she was staying. She was healing the man who had destroyed her home. Why did she care if I lived to see the morning? I grabbed her wrist, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Don't heal me," I managed to choke out, the words tasting like copper. "Let the silver finish it." I meant it. In that moment of agony, the weight of the crown felt too heavy to bear, and the thought of peace beckoned from the abyss. But Ayla didn't listen. She jerked her arm back and glared at me with a fire that burned through my fever. "You don't get the easy way out," she snapped. "You have to live with what you've done, Kael, and I won't be the one to let you escape your penance." She pressed a soaked cloth into the wound, and I let out a guttural roar that surely echoed to the highest battlements of the fortress. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of agony, and her voice, a steady melodic hum that kept me anchored to the earth. Because she was touching me, my alpha rage began to subside, the primal beast within me curling up like a kitten at her feet. It was a humiliating, terrifying surrender. She was an omega, the lowest of the low, and she was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing me whole. Hours passed in a haze of pain and the rhythmic sound of her movements. When the fever finally broke, the room was bathed in the soft, gray light of pre-dawn. I looked down to see my side neatly bandaged, the black veins of the silver poison having receded. Ayla was sitting on the floor beside the stool, her head resting against my knee, fast asleep from exhaustion. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and lightly touched a stray lock of her hair. In the silence of the morning, I realized the truth I had been running from. I didn't just want her for her blood or her skills. I needed her to keep from becoming the monster everyone already believed I was. Chapter 9. The Shadow of the Assassin. The piece of the fortress was a fragile glass ornament, and tonight, someone had decided to shatter it. I was walking the perimeter of the inner courtyard, the wound in my side a dull ache that reminded me of Ayla's touch, when a sudden high-pitched scream sliced through the mountain air. It didn't come from the barracks or the gatehouse. It came from the healer's wing. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen in an instant. Because I had spent my life as a hunter, I didn't need to think. My body shifted into a blur of speed and instinct, my boots barely touching the stone as I raced toward her room. I kicked the door open with enough force to splinter the oak. The scene inside was a chaotic nightmare. Ayla was backed into a corner, her hands raised in a futile gesture of defense, while a figure draped in the gray rags of a rogue lunged at her with a serrated blade. The assassin moved with a mechanical, soulless efficiency, a professional sent to tie up a loose end. I didn't growl. I didn't warn. I hit the attacker like a falling star, my hand wrapping around his throat and slamming him into the stone wall with a sickening thud. The sound of his vertebrae snapping was the most satisfying thing I had ever heard. "Kael, stop!" Ayla's voice reached me through the red fog of my fury, but I was already beyond reason. I shifted my grip, my claws extending as I prepared to tear the man's head from his shoulders. This wasn't just a threat to my pack. This was an intrusion into the one place I had deemed sacred. My possessive instinct, dormant for years, had awakened with a roar that threatened to consume the entire castle. I wanted to hunt down whoever had sent this dog and turn their territory into a wasteland of bone and ash. How dare they touch what was mine? Because Ayla grabbed my arm, I managed to freeze, the heat of her palms acting as a circuit breaker for my rage. I looked down at the assassin, whose face was turning a mottled purple, and then back at her. She was shaking, her eyes wide with a terror that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I dropped the body, a lifeless heap of meat on the floor, and turned toward her, my chest heaving. "Are you hurt?" I demanded, my voice sounding like grinding stones. I reached for her, checking her neck, her arms, my hands searching for any sign of a wound I couldn't heal. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was barely a thread of sound. He just came through the window. He didn't say anything." I pulled her into my arms, ignoring the way she stiffened for a second before melting against my chest. I held her with a desperation that terrified me, my chin resting on the top of her head. I could feel the frantic beat of her heart against my ribs, a reminder of how close I had come to losing the only light in this godforsaken world. The pack would be whispering tomorrow. They would see their alpha protecting an omega and call it weakness. Let them. I looked over her shoulder at the dead man on the floor, noticing a small black coin that had fallen from his pocket. It bore the crest of the Alpha Council, the governing body of the 7 great packs. This wasn't a random rogue. This was a political execution. They were afraid of her. They were afraid of the way she could calm an alpha's rage and the way she made me question the very foundation of our laws. Because they had tried to take her, the war was no longer about territory or resources. It was personal. "You're moving into my chambers," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. Ayla looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for a reason she could understand. "It's not safe here. They'll send more." I didn't tell her that I also needed her near, because the thought of her being more than a stone's throw away felt like an amputation. I scooped her up in my arms, carrying her out of the room and past the gathering crowd of warriors. As we walked through the torchlit halls, I felt the shift in the atmosphere, the awe, the confusion, and the brewing storm. The Alpha Council had just declared war on my heart, and they were about to find out why I was called the Iron Alpha. Chapter 10. The Den of Vipers. The great hall of the Alpha Council smelled of ancient dust, wet fur, and the suffocating arrogance of men who had forgotten the cost of the blood they spilled. Because I was summoned to answer for my deviations, I walked into the chamber with my head held high, the heavy thud of my boots echoing like a rhythmic challenge against the marble floor. 6 alphas sat in a semicircle of carved stone thrones, their faces masked in shadows and judgment. They were the architects of our laws, the keepers of a hierarchy that thrived on the crushing of the weak. I felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that tried to force my knees to the ground, but I remained upright, my hand resting casually on the hilt of the sword I had reclaimed. "Kael of the Ironfang," a voice rasped from the center chair. It was Alpha Silas, a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment and whose heart was rumored to be made of flint. "We hear whispers of a change in your territory. We hear of an Alpha who houses an Omega in his private quarters and a healer who treats the enemy with the same care as her own." The air in the room grew cold, the torches flickering as if sensitive to the malice radiating from the council members. I didn't flinch. I knew that in this room, any sign of hesitation was an invitation for the pack to tear you apart. I looked Silas directly in his milky, clouded eyes. "The Ashfall territory is mine by right of conquest," I stated, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that filled the cavernous space. "How I govern my people, and who I choose to guard my halls is no concern of this council." A murmur of outrage rippled through the seated men. Because I had challenged their authority, the atmosphere shifted from a hearing to a confrontation. Silas leaned forward, the gold rings on his fingers glinting in the firelight. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating the exact moment to strike at my throat. "It becomes our concern when your actions threaten the purity of the great bond," Silas countered, his voice dripping with a false, oily concern. "An Omega is a tool, Kael, a servant. By elevating her, you weaken the image of the Alpha to every pack in the realm. You are planting seeds of rebellion in the hearts of those who should only know their place." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of his fear. They weren't worried about purity. They were terrified of the possibility that the world could function without the boot of the strong on the neck of the vulnerable. They were afraid of the girl who had made me drop my sword. The tension reached a breaking point when Silas gestured to a hidden doorway. A hooded figure emerged, carrying a heavy, iron-bound ledger that looked older than the fortress itself. "We did not summon you merely to discuss your domestic choices, Iron Alpha," Silas whispered, a cruel smile stretching his thin lips. "We summoned you because we have uncovered the truth about the female you protect." Because he paused for dramatic effect, I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I thought I knew everything about Ayla, her grief, her courage, her skill. But the way these vultures were circling suggested a secret I hadn't even begun to fathom. Silas flipped the ledger open, his skeletal finger tracing a line of ancient, faded script. "She is not just an Omega from a broken pack," he declared, his voice rising to fill the hall with a terrifying authority. "She carries the dormant bloodline of the primordial healers, the ones who could strip an alpha of his rage with a single touch." The other alphas shifted in their seats, their expressions turning from disdain to a hungry, predatory greed. This was the nightmare I had feared. If Ayla was a living legend, she was no longer a person to them. She was a weapon to be seized and controlled. I took a step forward, my claws beginning to prick at my palms. "She is under my protection," I roared, the sound shaking the very foundations of the council chamber. "Anyone who attempts to lay a hand on her will find their head on a spike at the Ironfang gate." Silas didn't flinch at my threat. Instead, he closed the ledger with a final, heavy thud. "You cannot protect what the world is destined to hunt, Kael. If you do not hand her over to the council for safekeeping, we will be forced to declare you a rogue, and you know what happens to rogues who harbor anomalies." I left the hall without another word, the weight of their greed following me like a shroud.
Chapter 11. The Golden Cage. The Alpha's private chambers were a fortress within a fortress, filled with the scent of Kael, amber, rain, and the underlying metallic tang of his constant readiness for war. Because he had moved me here after the attack, I felt safer, yet the walls seemed to be closing in on me with every passing hour. I spent my time pacing the thick rugs, my fingers tracing the intricate carvings on his heavy oak furniture. I was no longer a healer in a public wing. I was a secret kept under lock and key. The luxury of the room, the silk hangings, the roaring fire, the soft bed, felt like a beautiful distraction from the reality that my life was being bargained for in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter. Kael returned from the council meeting looking like a man who had been through a physical grinder. His face was a mask of simmering fury, and his eyes were so bright with golden fire that they seemed to illuminate the dim corners of the room. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered peaks of his kingdom. I approached him cautiously, my heart aching at the tension in his shoulders. I wanted to ask him what had happened, but I was afraid that the answer would be the one that finally broke the fragile peace we had built. "What did they say, Kael?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the crackle of the hearth. He turned to look at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. I saw a flash of raw, unfiltered fear in his gaze, a look that shouldn't belong on the face of the Iron Alpha. He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek with a tenderness that made my breath hitch. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, a gesture so possessive and gentle that it made the mate bond between us sing a frantic, beautiful song. Why was he looking at me as if I were already a ghost? "They know who you are, Ayla," he said, his voice a low, pained rumble. "They know about the blood in your veins. They call it the healer's bloodline." I froze, the name echoing in my mind like a distant memory of a story my mother used to tell. She had spoken of women who could mend not just flesh, but the very soul of the wolf, women who were hunted into extinction because the alphas of old feared their power to take away the rage that defined them. Because I carried that blood, I wasn't just an omega anymore. I was a threat to the natural order of the world. Kael pulled me closer, his forehead resting against mine as he drew in a shaky breath. "Every pack in the realm will be coming for you now," he whispered. "They won't see a girl. They'll see a prize that can make them invincible, or a danger that needs to be neutralized." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, the reality of my situation finally sinking in. I had spent my life trying to be invisible, only to find out that I was born with a target on my soul. I clutched at his tunic, my fingers bunching the dark fabric as I searched for an anchor in the rising storm. "Are you going to give me to them?" I asked, the question tasting like ash in my mouth. Kyle's grip on me tightened until it was almost painful, his wolf rising to the surface in a low, protective growl. "I would burn the world to cinders before I let them touch you," he swore, the conviction in his voice so absolute that it made my heart skip a beat. In that moment, the fear was eclipsed by a sudden, white-hot surge of affection. He was willing to lose everything, his pack, his title, his life, just to keep me safe from the vipers he called his peers. I looked up into his eyes, and the distance between us seemed to vanish. The bond was no longer a hum. It was a roar, a demand for closeness that we could no longer ignore. He leaned down, his lips hovering just a hair's breadth from mine, and I could feel the heat of his desire radiating off him in waves. Because the world was falling apart outside these doors, the small space between us felt like the only thing that was real. He kissed me then, a desperate, hungry collision of teeth and tongue that tasted of salvation and ruin. It was a promise made in the face of certain destruction, a marking of souls that no counsel could ever undo.
Chapter 12. The Messenger's Burden. The morning after the council meeting brought a silence to the Ironfang fortress that was more unsettling than 1,000 war cries. The warriors moved with a hushed urgency, their eyes darting toward my private quarters with a mixture of awe and suspicion. I stood on the balcony, watching the mist roll over the valley, my hand resting on Ayla's shoulder as she stood beside me. She felt fragile yet grounded, a paradox that I was only beginning to understand. Because I had claimed her in the dark of the night, my wolf was settled, but the man within me was more restless than ever. I knew the peace was an illusion, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a lone rider galloping toward the gate, the horse's breath coming in white plumes against the freezing air. The rider wore the colors of the Blackwood Pack, the rivals of the Ashfall, and a group known for their ruthlessness. I felt Ayla stiffen beside me, her hand gripping the stone railing until her knuckles turned white. We went down to the courtyard to meet the messenger, the atmosphere crackling with a renewed tension. The man looked exhausted, his face caked with mud, and his eyes wide with a message that seemed to be burning a hole in his chest. "Speak," I commanded, my voice echoing through the courtyard and drawing a crowd of my own warriors. The messenger fell to his knees, gasping for air as he fumbled with a leather scroll case. "The Blackwood Alpha. He sends a warning," the man panted, his gaze flickering toward Ayla for a split second before returning to the dirt. "The council has authorized a joint task force. They are calling it a cleansing. They move against the Ironfang at sunset if the female is not delivered to the neutral zone." A collective gasp went through my men. This wasn't just a political threat, it was an invitation to a massacre. Because the messenger had delivered his ultimatum, he seemed to think his job was done, but he had one more piece of poison to deliver. He looked up at me, a cruel glint in his eye that signaled he knew exactly how much damage he was about to do. "And Alpha Kael," he sneered, his voice loud enough for every warrior in the courtyard to hear. "Our Alpha says to tell the girl that he remembers her father's face. He says he remembers how you looked when you plunged your sword into the old man's heart during the Ashfall raid." The world stopped. The sound of the wind, the crackle of the torches, the breathing of my men. It all vanished. I felt Ayla's hand slip from my shoulder, as if I had suddenly turned to fire. I didn't need to look at her to know that her world had just shattered into a million jagged pieces. The secret I had buried under layers of war and duty, the fact that I was the one who had ended her lineage during the chaos of the conquest, had been unearthed and used as a weapon to destroy the one thing I valued more than my life. I turned to look at her, my heart breaking at the expression on her face. She wasn't angry. She looked hollow, as if the light I had fought so hard to protect had just been snuffed out by a single sentence. "Ayla," I whispered, reaching for her, but she stepped back, her eyes filled with a horror that made my soul scream. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice a hollow echo of the girl who had kissed me the night before. I couldn't lie to her. Not now. The truth was a mountain between us, and I was the one who had built it stone by bloody stone. Because I had been a soldier first and a man second, I had done things that could never be forgiven. I nodded slowly, the weight of my past finally crashing down on my head. She didn't scream or cry. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the stone as she disappeared back into the fortress. The messenger laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that snapped the last of my restraint. I lunged forward, my hand wrapping around his throat and lifting him off the ground before anyone could blink. "Go back to your master," I hissed, my voice a promise of extinction. "Tell him that I am coming for him, and tell him that the Iron Alpha has nothing left to lose." I threw him toward the gate and watched him scramble away, but the victory tasted like poison. I had saved her from the council, but I had lost her to myself.
Chapter 13. The Siege of Silence. The opulent walls of Kael's chambers had transformed into a tomb of gilded stone. I stood in the center of the room, my hands pressed against my ears as if I could physically push out the echo of the messenger's voice. Because the truth had been a jagged blade hidden in the dark, it had severed the fragile tether of trust I had begun to weave around my heart. The man who had held me with such desperate tenderness, the man whose wounds I had tended with my own soul, was the same monster who had silenced my father's final breath. Every memory of our shared intimacy felt like a betrayal of my blood, a sickening dance with the ghost of the man who had orphaned me. I looked at my hands, the very hands that had saved Kael's life from the silver poison, and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated loathing. Why had the universe played such a cruel trick on an Omega who only wanted to heal? I had been a fool to believe that a wolf of iron could ever be anything other than a destroyer. The heavy oak door groaned open, and I didn't need to turn around to know that the air had thickened with his presence. Kael didn't approach me. He stayed by the entrance, his shadow stretching across the rug like a dark stain that refused to be washed away. "Ayla, listen to me," Kael said, his voice sounding hollowed out, as if the iron in his soul had finally rusted through. Because he didn't try to touch me, I found the strength to lower my hands and face him, my eyes burning with a cold, dry heat. He looked smaller somehow, the weight of his sins bowing his massive shoulders until he seemed like a man drowning in a shallow grave. I wanted to scream at him, to claw the regret from his face, but my throat felt as though it had been filled with ash. I was a healer with no cure for the agony currently shredding my chest. "You knew," I whispered, the words sounding like the rustle of dead leaves against the floor. "The whole time you were protecting me, you knew you were the reason I had no one left to protect me." Kael closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw jumping with a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. He didn't offer excuses or talk of the necessities of war, which made his silence even more damning. He simply stood there, a silent monument to the devastation he had wrought upon my life. The mate bond, once a source of terrifying comfort, now felt like a parasite, feeding on my grief and his guilt. The silence was shattered by the sound of a distant explosion, followed by the frantic ringing of the fortress bells. The council wasn't waiting for sunset. They had begun their assault on the Ironfang gates. Because the world was literally falling apart around us, the personal tragedy between us felt both immense and insignificant. Kael's eyes snapped open, the golden fire returning to his gaze. But it was directed at the door, not at me. He was shifting back into the Alpha, the protector of the pack, while the man who had shattered my heart was forced to retreat into the shadows. "I cannot change the past, Ayla," he said, his voice regaining its steel as he reached for his heavy battle cloak. "But I will ensure you have a future, even if I am not a part of it." He turned to leave, his movements swift and purposeful, leaving me standing in the middle of a room that was no longer a sanctuary. I realized then that my fate was inextricably linked to his, not by love, but by a destiny that demanded blood for blood. As the first of the Ironfang war cries erupted from the courtyard below, I knew that the time for mourning was over. The war had arrived, and it was demanding a sacrifice I wasn't sure I was ready to give.
Chapter 14. The Banner of Rebellion. The Ironfang ramparts were a chaotic symphony of steel, fur, and the metallic scent of impending slaughter. I stood on the primary battlement, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the combined banners of the 6 other packs fluttered like the wings of carrion birds. They had come for the girl, but they would find only the teeth of a pack that had been born in the frost and forged in the fire. Because I had publicly claimed an Omega as my equal, I had forfeited my seat at their table, and I found that the loss felt like a weight being lifted from my soul. I was no longer an alpha of the council. I was the alpha of the Ironfang, and my law was the only one that mattered within these walls. "They're breaching the outer perimeter, Kael," Torin shouted, his face splattered with the oil of the defensive cauldrons. The air was filled with the whistling of arrows and the deep, guttural roars of shifting wolves. My men were fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness, driven by the knowledge that this was a war of extinction. We weren't just defending a territory. We were defending the idea that an alpha could choose mercy over tradition. I pulled my sword from its sheath, the iron singing a low, bloodthirsty note that matched the pounding of my heart. I looked down at the courtyard, where the first of the Blackwood warriors had managed to scale the walls. They were met with the full force of my elite guard, but for every one we cut down, 3 more seemed to take their place. The council had sent their best, fueled by a religious fervor to cleanse the anomaly of the healer's bloodline. Because I saw a young Blackwood soldier about to sink his teeth into the throat of one of my wounded, I leaped from the battlement, my cloak billowing like a shroud. I landed with a bone-jarring impact, my blade clearing a circle of space in a single sweeping arc. "Is this what the council calls honor?" I roared, my voice cutting through the din of the battle like a thunderclap. I moved through the fray with a lethal mechanical precision, my mind a cold vacuum of tactical calculation. I didn't fight for glory. I fought to buy her time. Every life I took was a prayer for her safety, a bloody offering to the gods of the pack to forgive the sins of my past. I felt the sting of a dozen minor cuts, the hot spray of enemy blood across my face, but I didn't slow down. I was the monster they feared, and I would show them exactly why they should have left the Ironfang in peace. Amidst the carnage, I saw Alpha Silas watching from the safety of the ridge, his white robes a stark contrast to the mud and gore of the battlefield. He wasn't fighting. He was waiting for us to tire, waiting for the weight of numbers to overwhelm the strength of our resolve. I felt a surge of pure, unfiltered hatred for the man who had orchestrated this madness. Because he had targeted Ayla, he had ensured that there would be no peace treaties, no negotiations, and no mercy. I would find him and I would show him the true meaning of the healer's power, not by saving him, but by making him feel every ounce of the pain he had caused. A sudden shift in the wind brought the scent of lavender and smoke to my nose. My heart stopped. Ayla shouldn't have been in the courtyard. She should have been in the hidden tunnels beneath the keep. I turned, my blade mid-swing, to see her standing on the steps of the healer's wing. She wasn't hiding. She was holding a bundle of medical supplies, her eyes fixed on the wounded warriors who were being dragged back from the front lines. She saw me then, her gaze locking onto mine through the haze of the battle, and for a second the war disappeared. She didn't look at me with hate anymore. She looked at me with a terrifying, calm determination. She saw the warriors falling, her own kin and her former enemies alike, and she chose her side. Because she was a healer, she couldn't let the slaughter go unanswered. She stepped into the chaos, her small frame a beacon of defiance against the backdrop of the burning fortress. I realized then that I couldn't protect her by keeping her in a cage. She was the storm, and I was merely the lightning that followed in her wake. I turned back to the enemy, my grip on my sword tightening until the leather groaned. If she was going to fight for their lives, I would fight to make sure she had the chance.
Chapter 15. The Breaking of the Walls. The world had become a kaleidoscope of agony, and I was the only thing holding the pieces together. I knelt in the dirt of the inner courtyard, my hands plunged into the warm, wet reality of a warrior's chest. He was an Ironfang soldier, a man who had likely laughed at my status as an Omega just days ago, but now he was just a father wanting to see his pups again. Because the battle had reached the inner sanctum, the safe zones were gone, replaced by a desperate grinding struggle for every inch of stone. I didn't have my herbs or my mortars. I had only the raw, untapped power of the bloodline that everyone was so eager to kill me for. I felt a strange, humming heat begin to radiate from my palms, a golden light that seeped into the warrior's skin and closed the jagged tear in his lung. It wasn't like the slow, methodical healing of my poultices. It was a violent, rapid restoration that drained the very breath from my lungs. The man gasped, his eyes flying open as the life returned to his limbs, and he looked at me with a fear that was quickly replaced by awe. I didn't wait for his thanks. I moved to the next body and the next, my vision tunneling until there was nothing but the heat of the blood and the golden glow of my own soul. Around me, the fortress was screaming. The great gate had finally groaned and collapsed, allowing a flood of Blackwood and Council warriors to pour into the heart of our home. I saw Kael in the center of the surge, a whirlwind of iron and fury that seemed to be the only thing keeping the tide at bay. He was a god of war, his armor shattered and his face a mask of gore, yet every time an enemy blade came near me, he was there to parry it. He was guarding my work with his life, a silent sentinel who asked for nothing in return for his sacrifice. Why did I feel the urge to run to him, even now when his hands were covered in the ghosts of my family? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just healing the Ironfang. I saw a wounded Blackwood scout lying near the fountain, his leg mangled and his eyes glazed with the onset of shock. My feet moved before my mind could protest. Because I was a healer of the primordial line, I couldn't choose who was worthy of life. I knelt beside the enemy, my hands glowing with that same terrifying gold, and watched as his shattered bone knitted back together. The Ironfang warriors nearby growled, their weapons raised to finish the job, but I stood over the boy, my eyes flashing with a power that made them hesitate. "No more!" I screamed, the sound echoing through the courtyard and temporarily silencing the clash of steel. "No more blood for a throne built on bones!" I felt the golden light within me expand, a shockwave of pure, empathetic energy that rippled outward from my body. It wasn't a physical blast, but an emotional one, a sudden, overwhelming surge of the pain and grief of every person in the courtyard. Warriors on both sides stumbled, their weapons dropping as they were forced to feel the agony they were inflicting on one another. The air grew heavy with the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks, and for a heartbeat, the war simply stopped. I looked up to see Kael standing a few feet away, his sword lowered and his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pride. He felt it too, the crushing reality of the lives he had taken and the life I was trying to preserve. Because the bond was a bridge, he was experiencing the full brunt of my power, his alpha rage being stripped away layer by layer until there was nothing left but the man I had kissed in the moonlight. We stood in the center of a silent battlefield, two broken souls surrounded by the wreckage of an old world. But the silence was a lie. From the shattered gate, Alpha Silas emerged, his face twisted in a mask of fanatical hatred. He wasn't affected by the light. His heart was too far gone into the darkness of his own ambition. He raised a crossbow, the bolt tipped with a shimmering blue-tinted silver that hummed with a lethal intent. He didn't aim for Kael. He aimed for me, the anomaly that threatened his control over the realm. "If the world cannot have a healer it can control," he hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then it will have no healer at all." I saw the bolt fly, a streak of blue light aimed directly at my heart, and I knew I was too exhausted to move. Chapter 16. The Shattered Mirror. The blue streak of the silver bolt was the only thing I saw, a finger of frozen lightning reaching for my chest. Because my body was a hollow vessel drained by the golden light, I could only watch it come, my heart stuttering in a final, frantic beat. But the impact never arrived. Instead, a wall of heat and dark leather slammed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs as I was thrown back against the cold stone of the fountain. I looked up, gasping for air, to see Kael standing where I had been a second before. The bolt hadn't missed. It was buried deep in his shoulder, the blue poison already beginning to hiss against his skin like water on a hot forge. He didn't fall. He stood like a titan carved from the mountain itself, though I could see the agonizing tremors racking his massive frame. Because the bolt was forged of concentrated silver and elder magic, it was designed to paralyze an alpha's heart in seconds. Kael turned his head toward me, his face pale and slick with sweat, his golden eyes losing their luster. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave me was a plea, not for his life, but for mine. He was offering himself as a shield one last time, a final act of penance for the father he had taken from me. "Ayla," he wheezed, the name sounding like a prayer whispered in a cathedral of ruins. He stumbled toward the fountain, his sword clattering to the cobblestones, the second time he had dropped his weapon for the sake of my soul. I scrambled toward him, my hands reaching for the bolt, but the silver burned my skin before I could even touch the wood. The poison was moving too fast, a network of black necrotic veins spreading from the wound toward his throat. My power was gone, the well of golden light dry and dusty from the effort of the battlefield. I was a healer who could only watch the man she loved and hated dissolve into the dark. I pulled his head into my lap, my tears washing the grime from his cheeks. Why was the universe so cruel that it gave me the truth of his betrayal only to snatch him away the moment he chose to save me? Because I felt the mate bond fraying, a literal tearing sensation in the center of my chest, I knew his time was measured in breaths. Around us, the warriors of the council moved in like vultures, sensing the fall of the Iron Alpha. Silas stepped forward, a fresh bolt already being notched into his bow, his face a mask of triumph that turned my grief into something much sharper and more dangerous. "Move away from the beast, little girl," Silas commanded, his voice dripping with a poisonous satisfaction. "He is a relic of a violent past, and you are the future we will mold in our image." I looked down at Kael, whose breathing had slowed to a ragged, wet rattle. He reached up, his fingers weakly brushing against the pendant of my father's silver leaf. In that moment, the betrayal didn't matter. The blood on his hands didn't matter. There was only the heat of his skin and the devastating reality that I wasn't ready to let the world go dark. I leaned down, my forehead resting against his, and felt the final flickering spark of his life reaching out for mine.
Chapter 17. The Penance of the Fallen. The darkness wasn't cold. It was a heavy, suffocating velvet that tasted of iron and regret. I could hear Ayla's voice. a distant melody drifting over a vast, black ocean, but I couldn't reach her. Because the silver poison had paralyzed my vocal cords, I couldn't tell her that I deserved this, that the bolt in my shoulder was the only honest thing I had earned in a decade of war. Every face I had ever broken, every life I had snuffed out in the name of the Ironfang, was standing in the shadows of my mind, watching me drown. I saw her father, his eyes reflecting the same courage I saw in hers, and I finally understood the magnitude of the hole I had ripped in her world. I felt the warmth of her tears on my face, a baptism I didn't deserve. I wanted to tell her to run, to leave my rotting corpse to the crows and find a way to the healer sanctuaries in the south, but I was anchored to the earth by her touch. Even as my heart slowed, the mate bond remained a stubborn, glowing thread that refused to snap. It was a tether of pure agony, forcing me to feel her devastation and her loathing alongside her inexplicable love. I was the monster who had killed her family, and yet she was holding me as if I were the only thing left in the world. Why was mercy so much more painful than the blade? The sound of Silas's voice cut through the fog, a shrill, arrogant tone that sparked a final dying ember of alpha rage in my gut. He was going to take her. He was going to turn her gift into a tool for his own tyranny. Because I couldn't stand, I tried to shift, but the silver roared through my nervous system, locking my muscles in a cage of fire. I was a failure. I had dropped my sword for her, but I hadn't been strong enough to change the world before it caught up to us. I felt my spirit beginning to drift, the pull of the great beyond becoming an irresistible tide that promised an end to the guilt. Just as the light began to fail, I felt a change in the air. Ayla's hands, which had been trembling against my skin, suddenly went still. I felt a surge of energy, not from my own body but from hers. It wasn't the warm, healing glow of before. It was something ancient, cold, and terrifyingly powerful. Because she had reached the absolute limit of her grief, the bloodline within her was no longer asking for permission to exist. It was taking control. I opened my eyes one last time, my vision tunneling, to see her standing over me, her hair whipping in a wind that shouldn't have existed within the courtyard walls. She looked down at me, and her eyes weren't green anymore. They were solid, shimmering gold, like two miniature suns. She wasn't an omega. She was a force of nature, a primordial healer who had finally realized that to save a life, she first had to command the death that threatened it. She reached down and gripped the silver bolt, and for the first time, the metal didn't hiss. It groaned, the silver turning to gray ash under the intensity of her touch. I felt the poison being sucked out of my veins, drawn back into her palms as if she were a vacuum for the darkness itself. The pain was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a cold, numbing void.
Chapter 18. The Abyss of Forgiveness. The silver poison tasted like bile and ancient hatred as it flowed into my system, but I didn't flinch. Because I had accepted that I was going to die to save him, the fear had vanished, replaced by a crystalline clarity that made every atom in the courtyard visible to me. I saw the molecular structure of the silver, the fraying edges of Kael's soul, and the terrified pulse in Silas's throat. I wasn't just healing a wound. I was rewriting the reality of the attack. I drew the last of the toxin into my own body, feeling it burn through my meridians, but I didn't let it touch my heart. I held it in my hands, a ball of swirling blue energy that hummed with a lethal vibration. I turned toward Silas, my feet barely touching the blood-slicked stones. The warriors who had been closing in on us scrambled backward, their primal instincts screaming at them that a predator far greater than any alpha had been unleashed. Silas raised his crossbow again, his hands shaking so violently that the bolt fell from the groove. What are you?" he stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I didn't answer with words. I simply opened my hands, releasing the silver poison back toward its creator. It didn't strike him like a bolt. It moved like a cloud of stinging wasps, settling into his skin and turning his white robes to rags of soot. He fell to his knees, clutching at his throat as the very poison he had intended for me began to feast on his own life. Because I was the one who had unleashed it, I felt every second of his agony, a dark, heavy weight that threatened to pull me into the same abyss he occupied. I could have let him die. I should have let him die. But as I looked at Kael, who was struggling to sit up behind me, I realized that blood for blood was the language of the old world. If I was going to build something new, I couldn't start it with an execution. I reached out and caught the poison before it could reach Silas's heart, drawing it back into the earth. Silas collapsed, unconscious but alive, his power shattered along with his pride. I felt the golden light within me begin to fade, the immense weight of the power receding back into the depths of my marrow. Because I had pushed myself beyond the limits of a human or wolf shell, I felt my knees buckle, the world spinning in a dizzying carousel of gray and black. I waited for the cold impact of the cobblestones, but once again, Kael was there. He caught me before I hit the ground, his arms strong and steady despite the devastation his body had just endured. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of terror, reverence, and a deep, soul-shattering sorrow. We were both covered in the evidence of our failures and our triumphs, two survivors of a war that had tried to consume us both. The courtyard was silent now, the warriors of the council standing in a wide circle, their weapons lowered. They weren't looking at Silas or the Ironfang commanders. They were looking at the Omega who had mastered the silver and the Alpha who had bared his throat for her. The hierarchy was broken, the rules of the pack dissolved in the golden light of my transformation. Ayla, Kael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain the past. He simply held me, his heart beating a steady, rhythmic cadence against my ear. I closed my eyes, leaning into his warmth despite everything that stood between us. We were standing at the edge of a cliff, the old world burning behind us, and a terrifying, unknown future waiting in the mist below. Because I had saved the man who killed my father, I had committed the ultimate treason against my blood. But as I felt Kael's tears on my hair, I knew it was the only way to finally stop the bleeding. The war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. Chapter 19. The Ash of the Covenant. The morning after the siege didn't bring the triumphant warmth of a new sun. It brought a cold, suffocating fog that clung to the ruins of the Ironfang fortress like a wet shroud. I stood on the jagged edge of the western rampart, my hands still stained with the silver-gray residue of the poison I had absorbed. Because the golden light had retreated, my body felt like a hollowed-out shell, every muscle screaming with the phantom weight of the lives I had momentarily touched. Below me, the courtyard was a mosaic of broken stone and silent bodies, the air heavy with the scent of charred timber and the metallic tang of 1,000 tragedies. I watched the survivors move through the wreckage, not as enemies, but as ghosts, their movements sluggish and drained of the feral rage that had fueled the night. Kael was standing near the center of the debris, his silhouette a sharp, dark line against the pale mist. He was directing the recovery efforts, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that no longer commanded through fear, but through a weary, undeniable authority. Every time he moved, I saw the hitch in his stride, a physical echo of the silver bolt he had taken for me. My heart gave a traitorous thud against my ribs. I hated him for the father he had stolen, yet I was bound to him by the life he had saved. How could a soul be expected to navigate a sea of such conflicting tides? Because I sensed him before I heard him, I didn't flinch when he finally climbed the stairs to join me on the wall. He didn't come close. He stayed several paces back, respecting the invisible boundary of my grief. The silence between us was a living thing, a jagged glass wall that reflected all our shared moments and the blood that stained them. I didn't look at him, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze, a heat that tried to thaw the ice around my heart. Why was he still trying to reach for me when I had already given him his life back? "The council isn't finished, Ayla," Kael said, his voice a somber vibration in the damp air. "Silas is in a coma, but the other alphas have retreated to the high seat. They are calling for a total mobilization, a crusade to wipe the Ironfang from the map before your infection spreads." I finally turned to face him, my eyes narrowing at the word, infection. That was how they saw mercy, as a disease that threatened the purity of their violent world. Because they couldn't control the light I carried, they intended to extinguish the entire mountain to ensure it never reached the valleys below. I looked at the silver leaf pendant in my hand, the metal cold and unforgiving. They want a war of extinction because they are terrified of a world where they aren't the monsters, I replied, my voice sounding older than I felt. Kael stepped closer then, the scent of rain and pine ash preceding him. They want to confront us at the high seat. They've summoned the entire realm to witness our execution. He looked out at the horizon, his jaw locked in a grimace of resolve. They think we are coming to beg for mercy. They don't realize we are coming to end the system that makes mercy a crime. I felt a spark of the old fire return to my chest, a heat that had nothing to do with the bloodline and everything to do with the girl who had once kissed a dying pup. We were two broken pieces of a shattered clock, yet somehow we were still ticking. I realized then that my father's death wouldn't be honored by more blood, but by the destruction of the machine that had demanded his life. We go together, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. Kael looked at me, a flash of pride and sorrow crossing his face. If we do this, Ayla, there is no coming back. We will either break the world or be crushed by it.
Chapter 20. The March of the Damned. The journey to the Alpha Council's high seat was a funeral procession for the old ways. I led the remnant of my pack, 300 warriors who had chosen to stand with an Omega over the traditions of their ancestors, through the narrow pass of the Titans. Because we carried no banners and sang no war songs, the forest was eerily silent as we passed, the very trees seeming to hold their breath in anticipation of the coming storm. I rode at the head of the column, the wound in my shoulder a constant throbbing reminder of the price of my transformation. Ayla rode beside me, her face a mask of serene determination that made my own resolve feel like brittle glass. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the way her hair caught the pale winter light and the way her hands rested steadily on the reins. She was the catalyst for every change in my soul, the woman who had forced a wolf of iron to feel the weight of the lives he had crushed. I knew she still looked at my hands and saw her father's blood. I knew that every time I touched her, she felt the ghost of a sword between us. Because I couldn't undo what I had done, I committed myself to being the shield that would allow her to build something better. I wasn't fighting for a throne anymore. I was fighting for the right to be her penance. "You're thinking about the raid," Ayla said, her voice cutting through the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of the darkness that always settled over me when we grew close. I didn't deny it. "I'm thinking about how much of the world I had to destroy before I found something worth saving," I replied, my voice a low rumble. She didn't offer me comfort, and I didn't want it. We were forged in the same fire, and the scars we carried were the only honest things we possessed. As we reached the summit of the final ridge, the high seat came into view. A massive amphitheater of white stone carved into the side of the great peak. Thousands of wolves from every pack in the realm had gathered, a sea of fur and steel that shimmered like a predator's eye in the sun. They were there to see the heretic Alpha and his abomination brought to heel, because the council had framed our rebellion as a threat to the very essence of the shifter race. The atmosphere was one of religious fervor. They didn't just want us dead. They wanted us to admit that power was the only God worth worshipping. "Look at them," I muttered, my hand tightening on my sword hilt. "They're waiting for a show." Ayla looked at the vast assembly, her expression unchanging. "Then let's give them a revelation," she whispered. We began our descent, the Ironfang warriors behind us shifting into their wolf forms, a low growl beginning to hum through the ranks. We weren't a pack anymore. We were a message. Every step we took toward the center of the amphitheater was a defiance of 1,000 years of history. Why did the sight of so many enemies make me feel more at peace than I had in years? The council elders sat on the highest tier, their white robes flowing around them like the wings of vultures. They watched our approach with a cold, detached hatred, their hands resting on the hilts of ceremonial daggers. Because they believed they held the moral high ground, they didn't order an immediate attack. They wanted the world to see us kneel. They wanted to hear the Iron Alpha beg for the life of his Omega. I felt the heat of Ayla's presence beside me, the mate bond pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that acted as a heartbeat for my own courage. We reached the center of the arena. The eyes of the entire werewolf realm fixed upon us, and the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs.
Chapter 21. The Threshold of the New World. Standing in the center of the high seat felt like being a single candle in the middle of a hurricane. The sheer scale of the hatred directed at us was a physical weight, a wall of sensory aggression that tried to force my spirit to its knees. Because I was an Omega, the hierarchy demanded that I look at the dirt, but I kept my gaze fixed on the elders above. I saw the greed in their eyes, the desperate need to possess the power I carried, and the absolute terror that they might fail. Around us, the warriors of a dozen packs stood ready to tear us apart at a single word from the high seat. I felt Kael's hand find mine, his grip a solid anchor in the churning sea of hostility. Alpha Kael of the Ironfang, the lead elder, a man with skin like cracked mud named Malphus, projected his voice so it echoed across the peaks. You stand accused of harboring a forbidden bloodline, of murdering your peers, and of elevating a servant to the status of a mate. Do you deny these crimes against the Great Spirit? The crowd erupted in a cacophony of snarls and howls, a primal demand for blood that made the very air vibrate. I felt Kael's muscles tense, his alpha aura expanding until it met the pressure of the crowd's hate, a clash of invisible forces that sent sparks of static through the air. Kael stepped forward, releasing my hand to address the assembly. I deny nothing, he roared, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the arena. I did harbor her. I did kill those who tried to murder her. And I did claim her, not as a servant, but as the only soul in this realm brave enough to tell me the truth of what I am. Because he spoke with the raw, unfiltered honesty of a dying man, the crowd shifted, the bloodlust momentarily replaced by a confused curiosity. They had expected a defense. They hadn't expected a confession that turned their own laws into a farce. The girl is a weapon of the primordial times, Malphus screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. She is a plague that will strip the strength from your bones and leave you as weak as the humans we hunt. She must be purged for the survival of the race. I stepped forward then, moving past Kael until I stood at the very edge of the elder's reach. I didn't feel the golden light this time. I felt something deeper, something quieter. I felt the collective pain of every wolf in that arena, the hidden wounds, the lost mates, the children dead in wars they didn't understand. I am not a plague, I said, my voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the amphitheater. I am the mirror you are afraid to look into. I reached out, my hands open and empty. You worship power because you are terrified of the silence that comes when the fighting stops. You kill the healers because you don't want to remember what it feels like to be whole. Because I was speaking to the hidden heart of the pack, I saw the younger warriors in the front rows falter, their weapons lowering an inch. The elders saw it too, and their faces twisted into a mask of frantic, desperate rage. Kill them! Malphus shrieked, his voice breaking as he realized he was losing the room. Kill them both now! The order was the spark that set the world on fire. The elite guards of the council lunged from the tiers, their claws extended and their eyes glowing with a forced, magical fury. Kael let out a roar that shook the earth, his own shift occurring in a blur of fur and bone as he became the black wolf of the Ironfang. But I didn't move. I closed my eyes and reached for the earth, calling not for the light of healing, but for the connection of the bond. I wasn't just going to save Kael, I was going to make them feel why he had dropped his sword. The final confrontation had begun, and the world was about to find out that mercy had teeth of its own. Chapter 22. The Shattering of the Crown. The high seat was no longer a place of judgment. It had become a slaughterhouse of the soul. Because the council's elite guards descended like a black wave of fur and steel, The air turned into a suffocating mist of frost and frantic breath. I watched as Kael, in his massive midnight-furred wolf form, met the first line of attackers with a ferocity that defied logic. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was a living shield, a wall of muscle and teeth that refused to let a single enemy blade come within a foot of my shadow. Every time a claw raked his flank, I felt the sharp, stinging echo through our bond, a physical vibration of his sacrifice that made my own blood hum with a terrifying golden resonance. I looked up at the High Elders, who were screaming for order, as their carefully constructed hierarchy dissolved into a primal brawl. They wanted me to be a victim, a prize to be hoarded, or a threat to be buried. Because they had spent centuries building a world on the broken backs of the weak, they could not conceive of a power that didn't require a throne. I felt the primordial blood in my veins beginning to boil, not with the gentle warmth of a healer, but with the searing heat of a sun that had finally tired of the dark. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for Kael. I stepped into the center of the carnage, my feet finding the rhythm of the chaos. As Kael lunged to snap the throat of a Blackwood assassin, I threw myself onto his back, my fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur of his neck. The warriors around us froze, their predatory minds unable to process the sight of an Omega prey mounting the most feared alpha in the realm. The mate bond didn't just flicker. It exploded into a blinding, white-hot bridge of light that linked our nervous systems into a single, terrifying entity. I wasn't just riding him, I was feeding him the very essence of my soul. "Now!" I screamed, the word vibrating with a frequency that cracked the stone beneath Kael's paws. Because I was channeling the healer's light directly into his alpha heart, his form began to change. He didn't just grow larger, he became luminous, his black fur shimmering with veins of liquid gold. The rage that usually drove a shifting wolf was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. He turned toward the council tiers, his eyes two burning stars that reflected the collective sins of everyone present. With a single, earth-shattering roar, he unleashed a shockwave of empathetic power that knocked the charging warriors flat against the marble. I felt the power draining from me, but I didn't stop. I leaned down and pressed my lips to the base of his ear, whispering the words that would end the old world forever. "Mark me, Kael, not as your servant, but as your equal." But as the words left my mouth, I realized the old ways were too small for this moment. I reached up and bared my own teeth, sinking them into the thick muscle of his shoulder at the exact moment he turned to nip the junction of my neck. We marked each other simultaneously, a forbidden, circular bond that shattered the very concept of the Alpha-Omega hierarchy. The light that erupted from our union was so bright that even the sun seemed to dim in shame.
Chapter 23. The Silence of the Stone. The world was a blur of golden light and the sudden, overwhelming sensation of knowing. Because Ayla had marked me back, the wall between our souls had vanished entirely. I wasn't just Kael anymore. I was the grief of a daughter, the hope of a healer, and the fierce protective love of a woman who had seen the worst of me and still chose to save my life. The alpha rage that had been my constant companion since my first kill was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing peace. I stood in the center of the high seat, my human form returning as the light receded, my hand gripped tightly in hers. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Thousands of warriors, the most violent and disciplined men in the world, stood paralyzed. They looked at the marks on our necks, the twin scars that glowed with a faint residual gold, and they saw the impossible. An Omega had claimed an Alpha. The hierarchy that had dictated every breath of our existence had been proven to be a lie, a flimsy veil pulled over a deeper, more powerful truth. I looked up at the High Elders, who were clutching their stone thrones as if they could keep the earth from shifting beneath them. "The bond is broken," Malphus shrieked, his voice thin and desperate in the stillness. "They have committed an abomination. Kill them before the Great Spirit strikes us all." But no one moved. Because the warriors had felt the shockwave of Ayla's empathy, they were no longer looking at us as targets. They were looking at their own hands, seeing the blood of their brothers for the first time without the filter of pack law. A young warrior from the Blackwood Pack, the same one who had led the charge, dropped his sword. The iron rang out against the stone, a solitary, perfect note of rebellion. One by one, the sound of falling steel began to fill the amphitheater. It was a rhythmic, metallic rain that washed away 1,000 years of tyranny. I felt Ayla's hand tremble in mine, and I pulled her closer, my arm wrapping around her waist. We hadn't won a war. We had simply made the fighting irrelevant. I looked at Malphas, whose face was a mask of crumbling marble. "The Great Spirit didn't strike us," I said, my voice carrying without effort to the highest tier. It finally spoke, and it said that the time of the sword is over. The council lost their authority in that single heartbeat. The warriors didn't attack. They simply turned and began to walk away, heading back to their own territories to tell the story of the Alpha who dropped his sword, and the Omega who picked up a soul. Because we had survived the impossible, the Ironfang was no longer a pack of warriors. It was a sanctuary. I looked down at Ayla, her eyes reflecting the first true dawn I had ever seen. The father she had lost could never be brought back, and the sins I had committed could never be fully erased. But as we stood amidst the discarded weapons of our enemies, I knew we had earned the right to try. Epilogue. The Garden of Mercy months had passed since the day the high seat fell. The Ironfang fortress was no longer a jagged crown of ice. It had been transformed into a place of growing things. I stood in the central courtyard, watching the pup Ayla had saved, the heir to the Ashfall throne, as he practiced his tracking skills in the tall grass. He wasn't training to be a killer. He was training to be a protector. Because Ayla had insisted that the youth of the packs be raised together, the courtyard was filled with children of every lineage, their laughter a sound that had once been forbidden within these walls. Ayla was at the far end of the garden, her hands buried in the rich black soil of her new healer sanctuary. She spent her days teaching the secret arts of the primordial bloodline to any Omega or Alpha who felt the call to mend rather than break. She looked up and caught my eye, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The bond between us was a steady, warm hum, a constant reminder that I was no longer a monster in the dark. I walked toward her, my boots no longer clicking with the sound of iron, but sinking softly into the earth she had healed. I sat beside her, watching the way the sunlight played across the twin marks on our necks. We were the leaders of a new world, one that was fragile and uncertain, but one that was finally breathing. "The Blackwood Alpha sent a messenger today," I said softly, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her brow. "He's asking for a healer to help with the winter fever." Ayla wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes shining with a quiet, triumphant light. "Tell him we'll send 3, she replied, "and tell him they aren't coming as prisoners." Because I had once believed that power was the only way to rule, I found my greatest strength in the simple act of letting go. I looked at the broadsword that hung on the wall of our chambers, a relic of a man I no longer recognized. It was covered in dust, its edge dull and forgotten. I was no longer the most feared Alpha in the realm, and I found that the title was a small price to pay for the peace of a woman's hand in mine. As the sun began to set over the peaceful valley, the world remembered me not for the blood I had spilled, but as the Alpha who dropped his sword for mercy. And for the first time in my life, I was finally whole.